this is really, if you like, a taster for a new Masters in Public Policy that we are launching at the University of Bath. You have information about it on your chairs. It is a 2-year course. It's done mostly by distance learning. There will be residentials here and in Bath. And it's a course which is designed to build the skills and knowledge and experience of people that want to work in public policy, or who are already in public policy but want to develop their knowledge to the level of a master's degree. And it will be across the piece in how we think about public policy, from the sort of theory of public policy, from political theory through to very practical applications, particularly in the field of data and digital, the sorts of things we're going to be talking about tonight. So when you've listened to what Paul has to say, if there's things that you want to ask him and then ask us about the course and what you might learn when you do the course, please do feel free to do so. We'll have a Q&A afterwards. And I first met Paul when he worked in the Prime Minister's Strategy Unit, doing strategic work on policy. They're in teams, things like crime, education, health, cross-cutting projects, looking at areas of policy with the sort of long term in mind, thinking strategically about what government should be doing. So that's where we first met Paul. But from there you went to the Home Office, I think.
I did. I went to be Director of Strategy in the Home Office in about 2008. So Gordon Brown had taken over in number 10. There was a period of time, and then I sort of moved over when Jackie Smith was Secretary of State, or Home Secretary, and stayed there for 3 different Secretaries of State, and then moved on in about I worked with about 2011. I think I moved out when Theresa May was had been Home Secretary for about a year or so. Yeah.
And then you went into what was then the Government Digital Service, I think.
No, so actually I spent a couple of years in Leicestershire County Council. So I did this secondment. It was a really interesting period because I didn't know, I didn't have my network. It was a different, I mean, it's very similar, but it was a different sort of environment. And that was fascinating. I did a bunch of things on schools reform, so what was happening on academies in the county and the repercussions of having academies on different school services. And I also worked in the Chief Exec's department on cross-service commissioning, so trying to get a number of services to come together so you spend more on the earlier interventions rather than the fortune on various different services at the acute level. Did that for a couple of years, then came back to first the Cabinet Office, working with Francis Maud. So originally coming back just to look at open data, which was had relatively recently really started to take off as a thing. And then quite quickly that broadened into a broader government innovation group in the Cabinet Office. So I had a mixture of the analysts in the Cabinet Office. I had a bunch of things on policy reform. So open policymaking was a title that we used to set up Policy Lab. And then also had a bunch of things on data, so including open data, and that started to evolve. And then it became a bigger thing. We realised that was sort of missing from the digital side, and then went over to the Government Digital Service, where I led the work on data.
And now in the ministry.
Now in the ministry, right now in the department, and it's interesting, really, that sort of arc of for me being there on the edge of public service reform, and actually to see how that evolved. In my journey, really, I suppose through data into the broader digital space, but actually, there's some of my colleagues, and it's interesting, some of us from those same times, when you say back in 2000 and whatever it was, 4, ending up in similar paths, because if you're interested in public service reform, actually, this is the space where so much of that is happening.
So what you can hear from that already immediately is that civil servants like Paul do different things. They do a mix of policy, delivery, both in the central government, sometimes in local government, and then back into departments. And that kind of mix in career means that you're exposed to lots of different things.
Right.
But I think what's really unique about Paul is just this, what he's done, the relationship between policy and data and digital. And so that's really what Paul's going to talk about this evening, because this is an interface which it isn't just about delivery, it isn't just about implementation, but nor is it just about policy. There's a very complex interface between the two in respect of data and digital government. So I will leave you, Paul, to
thank you. Yeah, and I should say, that for me is one of the reasons why with the IPR it's such an important partnership, because it's, I wish there was more places that were looking at those intersections, perhaps, and from people coming through into government. So that's one of the reasons why I'm here and why I'm very pleased to be. Right, so what I want to talk about is, in some ways, that path that I've been on. And I'm going to use the work on data as a sort of grounding point for that, for the talk this evening. But hopefully I'll give you that stretch out into those previous worlds, and why I think, my overall story, I think, is why I think that you can no longer have just simple policy professions or digital professions or people who work in data, particularly if you're a specialist analyst, but actually there's a deep need for these worlds to be connected in different ways than how they have been to date, and I think we're starting to see some of that happening. So, as you say, I've sort of gone through a bit of that journey. I'm going to start off with three things of what's new, particularly on the data and the digital part. A bit about my more recent time in the Ministry for Housing, Communities and Local Government, where I've been for a little under a year, and then some just challenges on the data side to get some of the juices flowing, get the right pattern. So what's new? Well, let's start off with what's not new. I had a particularly sort of moment burned in my mind quite a few years back now. It was with the heads of profession. Now I'm trying to remember, was it the heads of statistics or the heads of economics across the government departments? And I was there to say, look, there's this, lots of data science techniques, a lot of things on machine learning, lots of really interesting new techniques. But across government, we don't really have that. We don't really know where the people are that can do it and what we're going to do about that. And one of the heads of profession sort of leant back and folded their arms, microphone, and said, well, it's not like you invented maths, Paul. And it's like, I didn't invent maths. That's really not the thing. And in fact, there's this long and noble tradition of analysts working in government, and indeed I love these old visualizations from Florence Nightingale, back in the day, before government was even anything like we recognise it today, a really long and serious history of analytical work in and around government. But I'm not going to talk much about that. I just want to talk about where these new worlds combine, because we have, wrong button again, I'll get this right. We have the internet. How hard is it to find pictures of the internet on the internet? There's an irony. So this is me typing internet on my desk. Something really serious has changed in our environment with the technologies, but the processes, the mindsets that are associated with that. We're used to a world of social media and streaming, and the way in which we use data in and around our private lives has changed phenomenally. And I guess the question is, well, what are the implications of that change for the way in which we do work in and around government? So, as we've said, I took a bunch of data teams into Government Digital Service and set up, we had at the time 3 pillars. So there was a set of work on digital, a set of work on the deeper technologies, and I had this 3rd pillar on data. And I had brought together a bunch of teams from different places to start work on that. The times have changed, and that structure's not there. There's not a specific data strand now in GDS, but I still think this is quite a useful way into the story. So just apologies for retaining the use of this structure. So a little bit about data policy. So again, first thing, well, let's find where these places about policy making and data fit together. We have this luxury of being able to change the underlying decision-making framework in government through legislation. Now and again, though it takes a long time and it's often overstated as a lever. But one of the things we did do was recently in the Digital Economy Act, we had a strand that changed the terms on which you could do data access and data sharing across different parts of the public sector. So mainly for taking personal data for statistics, or for where there was a particular benefit for a citizen or a service user. Very much contested through the period of time. It took us about 5 years, so I was working on it for 5 years. I suspect others were working on it for longer. But last year that went through, and I think alongside the GDPR legislation is probably one of the big things that will change the terms of the debate on data in government. Having said that, I think this question of data sharing is often overstated as a problem. A number of times I've sat with groups of people from more junior to super senior going, we can't do this stuff because data sharing, the law won't allow us to do it. And very often when you start to probe into it, it evaporates as a reason. It's sort of a little bit like the Human Rights Act or something, like the health and safety or something. Actually you start to look at it, you can do more things. But when it is a hard stop, it's definitely a hard stop. And so that has been an important change, I think, in recent years, something that I was pleased to see come through. And on the policy side, something on a, if you think that's an area where in some ways we're trying to remove some of the restrictions appropriately in some places, in other areas it's interesting that we're trying to put, in some ways, more friction and more thought processes in. Now, I mentioned a little bit about the work we did on data science. I'll talk about that in a moment. But one of the things that I tried to have introduced right alongside when we started to talk about this in government and we started to bring this work together a few years back was to have with one of the strands about the ethics of using data science. I'm not sure if I like the word ethics in there, but it's the appropriate use of data science in that mix. So we ended up, we published a data science ethics framework for government 18 months ago, would it have been now? And it was really intended as a first step, certainly not the last step, and there was quite a few things. It's more like a mechanism. If you're working in government, you're starting to do a data science project, here's a way to work through some of the questions about, are you doing this properly? Is this going to be, you're going to do something that may be legal, but maybe deeply worrying to people, or are you going to do something that's accidentally illegal? There's a way to try and find your way through that process. So I'm glad to see that there. Really interesting process that we went through in trying to design that, but I'm glad now to see that agenda really picked up, not just for within government, but across the whole of economy, with our colleagues in DPMS and with organisations like the Royal Society, for instance, taking really active interest in that. And I do think it's very important that we have that element of policy. So if you like, policy about this very fast-moving agenda in place. One of the other things that we're working on in that data side is trying to fix government's data infrastructure. And I think it's probably no surprise to say that quite a lot of this is in a mess. If any of you analysts have been working, I thought I'd usually get a good groan at that point, or a sort of few embarrassed laughs. This is a horrifically typical question. So this is actually from Companies House, but it's no they're a fabulous digital team over there in Companies House. But this is a field that really should say UK. But we've relied on free text entry on web forms to say what country you're from. So, I'm from Scotland. But of course, this makes it really difficult. You're then going to try and use that data to be able to do a drop down of if you're making a web form or you're building a digital service. This is a massive pain point. But I think the biggest challenge comes around when it comes to analysis. And of course, we've got sophisticated tools that can work through some of these issues, but it's all time and friction and hassle. And very often people just throw their hands up and go, it's just too hard, or it tends to take too much time or money to work through. So we were looking at this thing that we were calling registers, and it was the premise that actually in any organisation, at the moment you're holding and you're creating lists of things that you're not responsible for. So if you take something like Food Standards Agency or something like that, they'd be curating lists of businesses, lists of local authorities, lists of countries, all that they knew were probably wrong because they're from web forms, but there was no authoritative source that they could pull that data into their own service. And at the same time, they were also producing really valuable data, like the 1 to 5 star thing, the green form that you see on restaurants and takeaways and stuff. Now that data, again, is really interesting to other services that might want to use that for analysis or in the moment of a transaction, but it was very hard to get hold of and accessible data. So we worked through a program, it's still very much ongoing, on what we call registers. So here's an example of, within my department, the register of local authorities in England, because only in England, because that's the only authority that we have. So we have a named curator of that data set. It's their job to keep that data set up to date. It's there through a platform in GDS, and others, whether in the public sector or the private sector, can draw on that and know that that is the authoritative list of local authorities. So have a look if you're interested. There's a bunch there. It's fabulous, but it's really boring in a really important way, and I'll talk about that in a moment. Another thing on the infrastructure side is, I think this is so important from policy. I really wish my policy colleagues would deeply understand this issue, and unfortunately too few, I think, do at the moment, though I think that's changing, is realising that we no longer need to rely on bulk data shares where you have a bulk download of all or some of a big database, and you transplant and make a copy across, and then you use that within your own processes. And we have, it's hardly new, folks. We have the ability to be able to query data sets with our machines through application programming interfaces, APIs. And these are not new things, but in the public sector it still feels like this is quite a new technology and certainly not widespread. So our colleagues in HMRC have actually been in many ways at the forefront of that, and across government we're starting to see some of the technical guidance coming through for APIs, so people can know how to, what the processes are, what the technical standards are, so you can query from one data set to another data set. It allows you to do things like saying, does Paul earn over £40,000 and has he been resident in the country for a certain number of years, so people can work out whether I should, say, be a visa sponsor or something like that, without having to go, I'm going to download all of Paul's history of earnings in order to ask that sort of question. So there are advantages in terms of efficiency and speed, but also in terms of the control and access and privacy of data to the public. And you'll be able to see, there's some nice examples where you can see, so we're going to check now a number of different data sets to see if this is true, and there's a greater visibility about that data. Another type of, again, of core data that I think is a sort of infrastructure that is often not thought about is, we talk about data in lots of different ways. We talk about data like very high value, refined products that ask lots of questions from clean data and it's gone through a process. There's tons of data about stuff, about things. There's actually a relatively small number of data that many other data sets sit on top of, and that data set, those data are really, really important. So for something like addresses, is there a free and open and accessible list of all the addresses in the country? There are in these places, and not so much at all in the UK. Similarly, things like our mapping, the core detailed mapping of the country, is something that the Chancellor picked up in the budget in spring, and this is something again that people are, wasn't spring, sorry, budget's now in November, beg pardon, and something that we're working with across government. And the reason why I mention it in the context of thinking about policy and public policy is the terms, and this isn't like maps, like you go to a shop and buy a map. This is maps as in a collection of data sets and references that enable you to link lots of other data together and situate it in a place. So that the licenses, the way in which that data is held, the accessibility of that data, it becomes actually a public policy question and a spending question, not so much a technical question. So that's something that people are working through at the moment, and again, a nice example. And the third bit I was talking about on the data program is around how do we use data better. And I think some really, really interesting things about yes, we fix all plumbing on data, but what do we then do with it? So a few years ago, we started off that program that I've alluded to. We started to say, I've got like 3 or 4 data scientists in GDS. We know of, the others in the security world. We know a few that we've bumped into, but we had no sort of common picture of what was happening there. So we knew that there would be lots more and some really interesting things going on in places like the Health and Safety Executive, places you might not have thought of being necessarily real centerpieces for this type of activity. But we did find that, and actually since we've got some real centres of excellence, so things like this is from the Data Science Campus in Newport, which is part of the Office for National Statistics. So for me going from that conversation some years ago of people saying, well, Paul, this is all, we've been doing maths for years, what's changed, through to the ONS having this really cutting edge, fabulous resource doing some really fascinating work, I think is a really big step forward. And we do things like, we brought together, and I'll talk about this a bit more about what it means to be really of the internet and of the sort of times we live in, a bottom-up community of those data scientists, sharing their experiences, working together in Slack, sharing codes, having meetups, just working in a very, very different way from our top-down hierarchical, sort of Humphrey-ish archetype or stereotype, really, of how government works, although sometimes it does feel we're a little bit too much like that now and again. Yes, sorry, the other things are on open data. I mentioned I looked after that. We're still there right at the top of the international tables of making our data sets open. It allows lots of interesting things. So, of course, it's changed how we think about transport. we wouldn't go about getting on buses and tubes and trains and finding parking spaces in anything like the same way now as we did a few years back. And making data that was either gathering dust on civil service machines or some more active process than that, making that available to entrepreneurs, whether civic or private or indeed in public, has resulted in lots of changes. So again, it's thinking about bringing this back to policy. Actually, your policy problem can shift and change if you enable a different way of others to come at those problems. Instead of having a big government database of all the timetables in the world, actually getting that data out and allowing other people to do it has made a massive difference. So this was just an example from relatively recently. My department released energy performance certificate. So when you move house, you have to get the certificate. It says how heat efficient is your house. Well, that data set, we made that available, but one of the interesting things, it also contains square footage of houses. So it enabled people to put together that data with lots of other data. So I'm interested, I'll talk about on the housing and land and planning data side. You've got really interesting visualizations, really these are within 24, 48 hours of us releasing that data set. You've got a really different take of how people are being able to analyze and inform people about the nature of the property market and the prices of the property market. So in many cases, an unforeseen benefit as a result of that data. So that gives you a bit of a sense of, over the last few years, I think, hopefully a sense of where, as a government, and at the centre, we've been trying to move some of that debate. I'm going to give you now just a bit of thought about what it feels like having made that shift back again to a big department, taking on the roles not just on data, but of the broader digital and technology space, and what that feels like. So as the colleague took that photo, as I was wrestling with our, I don't know how old, 10-year-old laptops and things. Now, the good news is, we have real machines, and they're being rolled out as part of my job for this summer for all the thousands of civil servants. I can't watch that, just, sorry. Across our department, so also the systems underneath that. But I think the reason I included it, not is because government's not capable of changing those things. We are, and we're on it, and that is changing and will be really good. But it's just a reminder that it's easy to talk about all the highfalutin things like machine learning and data science and other things, and actually there's quite a lot of the day-to-day fixing that needs to happen across not just my department, not just other parts of Whitehall, but across many of the other parts of the public sector in order to make this network come together. And again, that comes down to what level of leadership and understanding is there about how much this has changed, how important it is for the day-to-day operation of the organisations. So in my job, I'm looking after a couple of things on the corporate side, so the kit and the systems that underpin that. Also thinking about how the digital world is changing how we work as an organisation. So being able to collaborate, working more openly, iterating rather than looking for big bang solutions, all those things that we've learned from how we've developed software and applying them into other areas. But I also use the world of digital to support the core activity of our department. So on the housing agenda, probably the government's biggest domestic policy agenda at the moment, and also on local government reform. So just a little bit on the housing side, and it's really noticeable from the housing white paper published about a year ago, actually, almost exactly. The focus on fixing a broken market is really explicit that was, there are issues with the way in which that market is structured, and what we're trying to do is to help bring some reform and change into that market, make it easier for SME housing developers to be able to go and find places that they could develop and understand the risks and consequences of taking on those developments. But when we did some internal work and user research with the entrepreneurs in the sector, and whether the digital and data entrepreneurs or the housing developers, sorry, different types of developers themselves, you found these actually there's a real barrier here to be able to find the data in the first place. It's there often, but it's not there from a perspective of someone's trying to build a product on top of that data. And again, it comes back to how much of a technical skill set do we have in government that understands what a machine readable data set that is reliable, that you could go and build a business on really, really looks like, and trying to bring that skill set in is something that I'm very much focused on. But there are great examples. So Land Insight is one of those SMEs doing interesting things. Urban Intelligence, again bringing together all the data around the London plans. They're making use of this data from across the public sector. The second thing I mentioned about local authorities, again, really, really fascinating space. So we're not short of people going, maybe we should do more progress on digital across local government. So this Nestor report, actually, it's got a date from only really, well, it's a couple of years ago, but I think actually a lot of the work was happening prior to that as well. And there's many, many other things that I could have included there. Really, we've also have this is something from the local GovCamp. These collection of people working like at the coalface in digital across local governments. There is this community there. They are coming together. They are sharing. They are starting to work in a different way. They're realizing that it's not a big one size fits all single system for, I don't know, pick your thing, housing or repairs or whatever it may be. But actually understanding we've got to move towards disaggregated software in the way that the rest of the world has done, understanding that the access to data through open APIs is a really fundamental part of enabling current reform, but the next generation of reform. And more than anything, I'd say an obsessive focus on the citizen lived experience and the sort of user needs if it's a transaction, but that really, really hard focus on not just the technology, but what is the need of the service change that is required. So I'm working in concert with those reformers across the local government sector and with others in central government that have an impact to try and think about how we can show that direction of reform, work with people, and things like developing common service patterns. And again, when we think about policy, do policy people think in the same sort of way? Of saying, all local government's different. It's different by feature, not as a bug. It's like constitutionally separate. A residence parking service is going to look different in Devon as it does in the city of Manchester on purpose because they're different places. But you know what? There's an awful lot of common features. You don't have to start from scratch, and you don't have to take a legacy product that sort of does it but is a terrible experience and doesn't allow you access to the data in order to get there. So we'll be working with people to try and develop these design patterns, these technical patterns, the routes through to procurement. But again, I think for me, the thing to pull out on the policy side is realising that common repeatable patterns and design patterns is something perhaps lacking from our itinerary, our toolkit, I mean. So this last bit really is just some things to perhaps get the conversation going, some things of reflections, private, personal reflections from me, given the jobs that I've done, thinking about this place of data and especially within the world we work in. So first is we just got to crack on and do this stuff. We had the government's transformation strategy published about a year ago. It sets out a broad direction. And what's interesting is to see, okay, we don't have a central data team in GDS anymore, we don't have that same sort of focus, but what we do have is the main government departments really taking this issue on. I'm doing it in my department, and there's plenty of others in the big main departments making this stuff happen. A second challenge is Mr. Ministers, AI can transform the way you live right now. And I think there's a lot in understanding that we're right at the foothills of what artificial intelligence and machine learning can do. Yes, it's very hard, but actually I think that the opportunity for some very serious changes in the efficiency, the experience that we have, these are starting to work through now, and there's only more to come. I think when we're in that world, there are some, really, truly profound companies like DeepMind and others doing some really interesting work. But we also want you to understand and bring people with us and understand that the mechanisms that we need to develop trustworthiness in this agenda are very important. It's back to that the ethics of AI before. But things like just keeping a log of where are we using algorithms? Are we clear what data set the data was trained on? Are we clear which version of which algorithm was used for which decision? Actually, I think it's quite a lot of quite basic things that will help us out until the robots. We can't talk about data, we're talking about the robots and the robot apocalypse. Right. But there's something here about, okay, there's quite a lot of things we can do now, but quite what happens in 20 odd years, I don't know. I don't know about you, the sort of advert algorithms, I sort of feel like the singularity is some way off. They still can't work out that I don't want to watch that film on Netflix, and I've already watched that film, thanks very much. So I feel like it's not an imminent danger, but at some point the world changes very profoundly. And given how long it took me to get legislation on data access through, we do need to work on this now. So it's very good that Royal Society and others are looking at it. I think another challenge is you can't, you've got to do the hard work as well as the fancy work. And I was reminded from, I think it was Mike Bracken back in the day from Government Digital Service, showing these pictures of the fabulous water, the Victorian sort of water infrastructure and the pride that people took in doing plumbing well. There's a metaphor for us in our modern age to spend time getting our data infrastructures right, doing the hard work to understand that user-led design is not just a weird bolt-on, but actually is really fundamental to making the next generation work. A slight weird obsession of mine about data. This might seem very obvious to you from a government and policy background, but it is interesting. In fact, this was the example I was talking about earlier. There's lots of transactional digital services. A lot of the progress we've made in digital has been on transactions. So I want a thing. Government, can you give me the thing? This proves my eligibility. Yes, I'll give it you. But a lot of government isn't that. Government's about, it is about you, but it's about your family, your neighbours, the town, the people that get the side effects of the things that you do, the taxpayers and all those other things. And I think when we're thinking particularly about data, we've got to understand data in that context. So we often, accidentally almost talk about ownership of data. So I think there's points where, like that example from DVLA, are showing that the control and visibility about where your data is really, really important in those transactions. But when we're talking about, I don't want to be in a world where we just say, I'd like to remove my data from the statistical data set, please, so I control it. Or I don't want to let you work out that I shouldn't be fit to drive my car and I've got crashed into other people. There are consequences on others that we need to be really careful about when we talk through. And then my last bit really is, this is my plea, this is my big sort of message to you as a set of people interested in this, is that I've got this weird history where I've cut across these different government professions, and occasionally, it actually happened last week, I had to put in a box what government profession I was, and I was allowed a secondary one so long as it wasn't my job. And I just don't know what to put anymore. It's these things don't quite make sense to me. But I think there's a lot of us that have got to be in that place. We've got to sort of reform our understanding of how these things work. Yes, we can put lots of services on the internet, fine. But what do we really take as the lessons from the internet about the internet as a shorthand, of how we work, these sort of business processes, the mindset, the way of working into that space. So I've been a small part of a bottom-up community that's been working on that space between the digital and policy world. So one team government, nice active Twitter, as you'd expect, but also websites and blogs and other things. And for me, this is actually not government saying we need to do a thing. It's actually that people have found each other. People have found their own networks. So it's not, it's like when we did an unconference for the top 200 civil servants, they get together. But it's we don't belong to them. Some of us happen to be working in government, some in local government, some in commercial or civic sectors. But I think for me, this is the big message. And I'd say if you're interested in public policy in this day and age, then if you're not engaged in this sort of thinking in this community, that world's going to leave you behind. We did things so I did a reading list about digital for policy people to kind of maybe that helped, quite like reading stuff sometimes, don't we? And then, it's this is what, maybe that's not the point, maybe it's just go and do some stuff. And Kit Collingwood from DWP, I think, has got a really important message there about, you could read some stuff, or you could just go and do it, folks, which is probably the more important thing. And then, again, one thing from that list I would point out is things like really understanding this idea around government as a platform, not perhaps in the way that we've used it sometimes in GDS and recently to say component software, but actually really understanding this from the Tim O'Reilly point of view, and this idea that we provide a framework with which others can operate. So through data, through rules, through a license to operate, and actually understanding in the way that, you know, Amazon has blown apart how retail works. It's not about the shops, it's about the platform, and it provides places for other people to operate. Obviously true with all the major big platform internet companies. What are the implications of that at a profound level for us working in government? I don't think we're really working through it all. I think Mark Thompson from Methods is prompting in that space. Say Tim O'Reilly, back in 2010 was writing about it, but I'm not sure many of us have really understood that this, for me, is one of the really big shifts in public policy reform over the next decade or so. An example is like, what does that mean in practice? A nice one from, is it the London Ambulance Service, who worked on good stuff. So the idea is if you're trained as a person that can be a first responder and use a defibrillator and help people with heart attacks, you just sort of register. And so when that happens, they can ping, you know, the ambulance people can ping you, and if there's someone there that will get there quicker before the ambulance, then, you know, happy days. It's good until the ambulance comes. So that sort of thing for me starts to get to that space of the civic side of it as well as the service side. So that's me. I hope that gives you a sense of what I've done, a bit about the history, a bit more about the, I hope it's like not too techy about some of the changes that are going on. But I think my overall message is I think these distinct barriers between the policy world, the digital world, the data world, they have to shift and collapse, and people really have to have a deeper appreciation of these, of each other's. It's not just one direction, by the way, of each other's work and the value that can bring.